Now, yesterday we have been talking about the notion of death, and there are two important paradigms, two important philosophical postulates. One revolving around the individual body, the other connecting to the cosmic consciousness, and this cosmic consciousness is highly philosophical. But what I am trying to say is neither this or that, but an intermediate order which is essentially sociological. Death is an individual phenomenon, but at the same time it is a collective phenomenon. It is a societal phenomenon, it is a cultural phenomenon, in addition to being a cosmic phenomenon. So as an anthropologist, I would try to revolve my discussion around the important social practices and cultural diversities on such ideas of life, death in different parts of India. Here I take a stand that anthropology is the study of philosophy on the ground. There are different cultural systems, and each of them have developed a particular way of perceiving death, negotiating death, understanding death, and a diverse practices that have come up around such an activity. Now, what is the justification? Is there a justification of my talk here? There are two justifications. Number one, if we look at the work of Govind Sadasiv Ghurye, the famous anthropologist from Maharashtra, who called the aborigines of India, the tribes of India, as backward Hindus, and therefore much has to be worked out in context of these indigenous communities. The second justification comes from the idea that though social scientists regard tribe as distinct or different from the dominant Indian civilization, but there are strong cultural and historical and prehistoric connects between Indian tribes and the Indian civilization. Right from Ramayana, Mahabharata and other epic, there is clear-cut mention of how tribes constitute a part and parcel of Indian civilization. And that gives me the justification to talk about how a tribal life in India, an indigenous way of living with life and death, has been going on since time immemorial, and that is where the Sanatan Dharma of this country comes up as an ongoing flow of life, death, birth and rebirth. And my paper, my presentation will revolve around the systems of meanings and the systems of cosmologies that are derived from these indigenous communities in the first part, and in the second part I would try to connect it how the Hindu cosmologies can provide a template for understanding these cultural diversities. I also derive the justification from Mysore Narasimhachari Srinivas, the famous anthropologist, who has made a distinction between the study of the other culture or maybe our own culture by providing two important terms. There are textual Hinduism, there are Sanskritic Hinduism, and there are local Hinduisms. There are Hinduisms which are beyond the Sanskritic text, but they are located in an everyday practice. And therefore, my pitch will revolve around both the local Hinduism and also the Sanskritic Hinduism, which reflect the Sanatan Dharma of this country, around which and within which the Indian tribes and indigenous communities need to be understood. I currently, as Madam has just said, that currently I am interested in working on and I am currently working on how this Indian philosophy of Shara Darshan contains rich methodological inputs which social science in India and abroad needs to be imbibing, or social science in India and social science abroad is awaiting to be informed, to be enlightened by the rich methodological tradition of Indian 6 philosophical postulates. Having said this, and knowing fully well that the discipline of anthropology has always been a colonial science, it has always remained in the past, not in the present, has remained in the colonial science. Indian tribes have been worked on by Indian scholars and have been also worked on by Western scholars. So I will quote 2 Western authors, not to tell us the inevitability of their concept, but to remind us how superficial the concepts are and when there is a rich embeddedness of Indian concepts available as a counterpart of these 2 concepts. Now let us say, what are the concepts which Van Gennep used it as long as in 1909. He wrote a book, Rites de Passage. And in Rites de Passage, he examined all the rituals: birth, puberty, initiation, marriage, death. And all over the world and all over Indian content, there is a understanding of how death is a phase of transition. And the second concept, to which I will return little later, is the concept of liminality by Victor Turner, that I would come little later. Now at this point, I would like to make a sense out of what I will be talking around, that how death is simultaneously an organic event on one hand, and at the same time it is a complex mass of beliefs, emotions and activities on the other. And it is important to know how understanding death cannot escape from any one of them. Before we move to the Indological part, to the Hindu cosmologies, let me talk about how the early man, the prehistoric time, or right from the beginning of the dawn of human civilization, maybe 10,000 years before, or maybe during the Neolithic time, during the Mesolithic time, how there has been a negotiation around these 4 items. As far as the death is concerned, anthropologists and prehistorians and ethnoarchaeologists have talked of the corpse, the dead body itself. And the dead body itself is a heavy symbol. It is not an ordinary symbol, it is a heavy symbol, and it deals with some kind of judgment, some kind of assessment. And the judgment and the assessment comes up that if the condition of the dead body, of the corpse, is ideal, so-called culturally ideal, then the condition of the soul is well and good. And therefore, these heavy symbols of the corpse have been judged to know whether the person has died a good death or the person has not died a good death. So, archaeologists of Mesolithic and Neolithic time, they have identified that how the stuff of the dead, the personal belonging of the dead, is always buried, always cremated with the person who has died, and therefore the symbols of the dead person belongs to his dear objects. Most of the central Indian tribes, they erect memorial pillars on the occasion of the dead, and if there is a leader, and if there is a preacher, if there is a serious accomplished person, the memorial pillar would be big and it would contain all the accomplished activities of the person who has died. So The second one is the commemoration. Commemoration is erecting the memorial pillars or erecting the stone graves which calls for remembering the dead. And these becomes symbols of permanence that in the Northeast India among the Naga and among the Kuki and other tribal communities, you will find that huge memorial stones are erected. And at the same time, while they are talking of some kind of permanence, there are rituals which are performed to disconnect the dead from the collective memory. And anthropologists have called it as genealogical amnesia, that the whole community tries gradually to come out of the sorrow memories of the death. And therefore, it is a long period. And in this long period, there are many events which require, this third point, technologies of trade. Death is a costly thing, and death requires death and after death requires a relationship with money, and therefore there are funeral markets, there are death trade, and if dead people are powerful, they are also vulnerable for a huge expense of the death ritual. I know within my family, older people keeping a part of the money for their own cremations, for their own death ritual, thinking that the sons and the daughters may not be able to do it or may not want to do it. So there is a particularly earmarked money kept for this particular purpose. Say, given an option, I would like to keep a earmarked money for that. And many indigenous communities and many communities in the different parts of India, they perform this kind of practice. And these technologies of trade, the third one, also talks about building memorial stones, constructing memorial stones. And these memorial stones is a antithesis of body and spirit dialectics. That memorial stones undermine the idea of spirit, and at times it exaggerates the presence, eternal presence of the spirit. So what I am trying to say is that in case of death, there are two principles: the question of embodiment on one hand, vis-a-vis the question of dissolution on the other. Embodiment is materiality and dissolution is spirituality, to which we will return very soon. The last part of this particular portion of my talk is sovereignty or authority. Who owns the death? How is death managed and declared? How it is conquered? Who presides over the funeral? Who certifies the death? And if the dead person is a chief or a prophet, who has control over the last remains? And therefore, the sovereignty over life and death is rooted in both religion and science. And therefore, there is a need for a medical authority, which is medical authority during life and after death, which is culturally expressed and legally codified. Having said this, let me come to how in everyday life, in rest of the India, or in case of the so-called local Hinduism, how there is a connect between matter and spirit. Death is an occasion to rethink centrally and very seriously about matter and spirit. For example, a careful observation of death reveals that death has no reality except as a process of life. Except as a process of life. And one material of one form of life is broken up to serve as material for other forms of life. I recall some of the famous philosophers saying that the tears I shed yesterday has become the clouds of today. And therefore, the whole idea of connectedness with matter and spirit through could be Panch Mahabhut, or it could be through a great sense of materiality. We do not know. In different cultures they talk about different things. And therefore, here death talks about some kind of liminality, the idea of Turner, and liminality is nothing but the idea of Trishanku, or the way the way Hiranyakashipu was killed, neither there nor here, at the threshold, neither in the morning nor at the night, at the evening. So the ideas are there in our Hindu cosmologies, in our Hindu traditions, but social science research has been following the Western concepts more seriously, and that is what I was trying to demonstrate here. Let me talk a little bit on how liminality is a concept of transition. Funeral ceremony emphasizes on transition. At the same time, it emphasizes on separation, and therefore, the study of death rituals throughout India emphasizes the way the theme of transition seems to dominate the symbolism. Many times it is compared with water journey, the Vaitarini. We have to cross the water pathways. Many times in the Buddhist tradition, it is an island after world, but that island exists in us, it doesn't exist somewhere else. When Buddha became almost towards the last part